All right, guys, today we are looking at the next kind of fundamentals, which is depth, specifically through use of value and space. And then we'll look at perspective in the next lecture. But all three of those, value, space, and perspective, give off depth. And depth is important because ultimately it creates the illusion of three-dimensional objects that you're painting. It makes your painting more realistic, or your drawing more realistic. It makes it come to life because it creates the elements of three-dimensional artwork rather than strictly two-dimensional. So again, depth, you have value, space, and perspective. Today we're looking at just value and space. So let's start with value. And what does that mean? Well, in its most basic aspect, it simply refers to lightness and darkness, right? And so this is looking at the various levels, essentially, of how light or how dark the artwork is and the various values it has of that. So it's always within a sense of range that an artist can produce. All right, and this can do a couple of different things. One, it can impact the mood. So the artwork, whether it's more gloomy, whether it's more bright and cheery, of course, it can give it the depth that we were just talking about with three-dimensional aspects. It also it plays with essentially the realistic aspects of the art or objects in the art. Right? So one of the things that value focuses on is this idea of mimicking. So being able to mimic the appearance of anything, right? So of things, by replicating the effect of light on objects, right, in the real world. So if you want something to look realistic, what you have to do is look at how light is illuminating various things, and then replicate that in your art. If you can replicate that, it's going to create a more realistic style than if it's off. And even if we don't understand the full, we're going to look at the different types of values and the different ways that you can create this kind of depth with that. But even if you don't understand like the value scale and the specifics of that, we still kind of subconsciously know when we look at something whether it's accurate or not. And if you don't have the light source and the proper values reflected in that, you notice, even if you don't know why, that it looks off. So this is an important aspect of value, to be able to create depth, to be able to create a realistic aspect or structure. And then the various, it can be done in color or black and white. So we'll say black and white or color. And we'll look at the value scale in just a minute. And then just to give you an example of the mood, I guess I should have put it under mood, but here we'll connect it down to here. Like, one of the things is, okay, how can value create a mood or feeling? Well, one of the best examples of this were detective movies from the 1940s. And they had a very specific kind of genre and structure to them. And it was specifically filmed in often black and white and dark tones. And what this created was a sense of, well, really, it was mystery. It could create gloomy, or this idea of uncertainty. The idea of this kind of dark style film that became popular enough that it ended up getting its own kind of category, which was film noir, which means black film. And the idea was that you create this kind of dark and dreary setting that has this kind of moody feel. Just even making things darker creates a different type of mood, a darker, dreary kind of mood, or ominous would be that uncertainty, that ominous aspect of it, right? Where something seems like it's going to go wrong, and so you have to be careful with that. And so it was very effectively used within these Hollywood films. But you also have it in art, and we're going to look at a couple examples here. But before we look at some specific examples of how you do that, I want to look at the value scale, or range as it's called, and why this is important. So the value scale, most simply, and I'll show some examples here in just a second, is a series of different values. And it usually is just done in a line of boxes, right, where you would have some squares like this, and then you have them separated. And then what you would do, and this is what I had you guys do for your assignment, right, is that they would be numbered and colored in to match the value of the image that you were looking at. There's a total of, well, there's more, it's infinite. Total of 9 scales most often used. Okay, so it is unlimited, right, in scale, but what we can perceive, what we can perceive is around 9, and what most artists, and not everyone uses all 9. Nope. So is around 9. This does not mean, as mentioned, you do not have to use all 9. And this is replicating again what we see in the real world. Okay, and so what you would do is white tends to be the first, black, if we're doing the black and white scale, right, if that would be 9, and then everything in between, not that there's 9 there, right, or let's just, here we'll do it with 2, 3. So this would be 7, or if we were gonna, since I said 9, let's do 7, come on, 8, 9. Okay, so if we do the full kind of spectrum of what we tend to be able to see, white is 1, 9 is black, and then everything in between here is moving from light to dark, and in different, slightly different values of those colors or of those shades. And this, why is this important, right? So the idea of, okay, so you look at an artwork, or if an artist is creating something and they're like, what are the values I want to use? They often will create a value scale first to get a sense of what colors or shades they want to use. And it can be in, I don't think I said this, can be in black and white or color. Okay, and values, if it's color, it's the same hue. So for a value scale in color, that's called usually the hue, and specifically this is then referenced as tints and shades, right? Because it's not just one color, it's one value or one hue. For example, look at red. They have the hue of red, but then you have all the tints of that hue of red. And that's a value scale because it's showing from starting from lightest to darkest of those various tints of the red. Or, which I had you look at with a black and white picture, the shades of values starting from light and then the various levels of gray to black. Right, and so that, just to be clear, it doesn't have to, black and white is often the easiest and the one that you kind of start off with to look at. And certainly I think stands out the most in many ways, because you look at some of the tints with the singular hue, they can often begin to blend together more than sometimes the grays will do. But either works, and in just a minute I'll show that. So what is 4 here? Why is this important? Why do artists identify this before they sometimes paint? And why is it important to be able to identify if you are looking at art and trying to understand it? Well, really what it is that we see objects and understand objects because of how dark or light they are. Right, and we talked about just briefly that certain darker aspects can create a certain type of mood, so can lighter ones. We're also going to see in this lecture how more intense color is going to appear closer than more muted color. And so we see objects and understand them because of how dark and light they are. That is a huge part of that. And also, value is key to the illusion of light. And the illusion of light, right, if we go a step further, is key to what? It is key to depth. And the, we could say the illusion of three-dimensional objects. Okay, so, and all of that equals, right, realism or realistic, portrayal, realistic, I'll just leave it at realistic, that it looks real. You want it to look like it is actually a three-dimensional object. You want it to look like someone looks and goes, wow, that looks like a cup, or wow, that looks like a tree, or whatever you're drawing or viewing. These things are necessary for that. So they play a really important role. Even though it can kind of seem like, what's the point? It's really, really helpful. And especially, like, say you were wanting to do some kind of artwork in just one color, which is a very actually common practice because it helps you identify the values, is that what you do is you have to create a value scale really to then use after you're looking at the object, is marking up all the value scale of that object based on the color you want to use. So that when you begin to draw or paint it, you use the correct value scale. And again, why that's important, as mentioned, is because it creates the illusion of light. And so if you use the correct, tint or shade in the value scale, then it's going to appear correct as if that's how the light, if you took a picture or you went and looked at it, it will look the same. If you're off on your value scale, it's going to look off on your picture. So let's look at a couple of these an example of how you do it. So this is an example of a value scale with the black to white. So here you have the 9, right? Now remember, again, technically it's infinite. You can keep going. And the computers I guess the genius of computers is that it can create levels in between these that we can't even really perceive with our eyes. Is that necessary? Most of the time, no, because we're not going to recognize it anyway. Why? So why the 9? Because this tends to be the most that we can notice. And it gets more difficult for artists to try to differentiate much beyond that. You can a few, I've seen some where you definitely have like 10 or 11 if you're nitpicking the difference in value, but it's so small and minuscule of a difference that it's really just about picking them out rather than that you're noticing them if you're just looking at the art. So again, you have here, right, you start with white and you end with black. And then the scale is everything in between from the light to dark. And here they've broken it up into half tones in the middle with the lighter values here and the darker values here. You don't have to break it up in between, but it can help sometimes identify the transition point. Now, you want to see it in color. Here it is in color as well with red, right? So you have the dark aspect here, which is the red, the full hue, and then light, which is still the white where there is no hue, and then it moves from light to dark. So it doesn't change when it's in color, the value scale. It's just a matter of using the different hues. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So here they only did 7. And that, that's for color. As I mentioned, you start getting too close together and they blend together in color and it's hard to tell the difference, which is why black and white is often used as an example when we're looking or learning how to look at value scale. But you can see, like I said, the slow transition of the lighter hues and the tints here to the darker to where you have your final color, which is the darkest that you're going to go. And so if you were to create this ahead of time, if your whole painting or drawing was going to be in using the different values of red, then by creating this and having it next to your drawing, you are able to then, reference the object that you're going to do and look at the light source and determine which of these, the value scale you need to use. That also helps identify the color ahead of time in your materials, right? Because it's hard to replicate this in paint. If you're mixing these, you really need to have them done ahead of time. So that it stays consistent. Otherwise, you're going to have variants of this all over the place. Or let's say you're using colored pencils and you want to make sure you get your colored pencils out, or what 2 colored pencils, right, were used to mix that color. It helps make everything so it's easier to replicate that scale later, as also as to reference it when you're trying to create the illusion of light and make it actually look realistic. Then what I had you do was identify the value scale. So, right, it's one thing to just have, here's the value scale. The next important component of that is actually identifying the value scale in the art, because it can give you a sense of where the light is coming from. It can give you a sense of perspective, as well as, again, that sense of depth. So, and again, if you were wanting to replicate as an artist this, you have to be able to identify this. So as someone just observing and enjoying the art, this can just be helpful for getting a sense of where the light source is and how the light is playing off of the picture or the art. But if you were going to be an artist yourself and you're going to paint or draw or do whatever, you need to be able to identify the value scale so that when you create your artwork, if your goal is to replicate it in the most realistic three-dimensional sense, you need to be able to identify those to put them properly in the artwork that you're creating. And so here, right, they have the value scale up top, and then they're drawing a line, or you could simply just, let's see, what would be, like here is 5, right? You can also do it that way where you just write a 5, 6, and then you have them numbered up here. Either way works. in the identification, right? They drew lines, but it totally works. If you have it labeled up top on your actual value scale, then when you're identifying which of the on the scale is that value on the picture or the artwork, you can just number them and then reference it. It's just depending on what visually you like better, honestly. But this, again, this is that kind of key for being able to reproduce something realistically. So here's the one I had you do. So one of the first things I would do when identifying this, right, is look at where is white and where is black. And maybe you don't know, you know, how many numbers you're going to have to begin with. So you could start with doing 1 and then labeling black 9, and then you could move it back down to 8 or 7 or 6 if you don't come up with that many. And then once you've identified them all, then you would draw your value scale, right? Once you have identified what those are. So if we're looking at you know, full white, one of the things by identifying the full white area, which we can probably safely say is any of this part here, you know, maybe up here too, there's more than one place where you have that first value, is it gives you a sense of where the light source is coming from. And we'll see this with the later diagrams that we're going to look at, and how the light source then creates the highlight, which is an important part of identifying that. So here, you know, we can get a sense that the between, there's the white, and we'll put 9, here's the darkest, that the light source, right, is coming in from this direction, and vaguely from that general direction, and it's hitting there. Or you also have what looks like it might be coming from 2 points, at least how it's hitting and reflecting. Okay, then from there we can go, okay, what's the next one? Well, one of the things of why I picked the spiral staircase is because it's easier to identify, because it kind of gives you an ordered value scale. Right, this here helps provide a value scale to a degree. Of course, you have the light on this side, so all of this on this side is the light, and then all of this on this side is the dark. And so you can kind of create the value scale for each side based on that. So we definitely have here, and then here it gets a little bit darker. If we're looking at it where we've run out of space here, we can go down to the next one and say, okay, if this was a 3, here's 4, here's 5, and then we go over to the darker side, because that's getting pretty dark at this point, right? This looks like the 5 again, and then you say that's 6, run out of space, dark. This one looks about the same. It has a darker area here, but then you have 7 and what I would classify here as up there as 8. Now, this is not the only place you can get them. There you could look at the value on the rails itself. You could look down here. And it is, when you're just eyeballing what that value is, what you would do is then try to replicate that in the scale and make sure that those colors lined up and that they were moving in order from light to dark. And then you could reassess based on where you were looking. So again, if you got them down here, right, or here, where you were trying to find like a kind of darker one for like 8, that would probably be an 8 right there, where it has just not the lines, but the in between has just enough, versus we've got solid black here, right? And what looks like, you know, here and here solid white. So it's just about yours might look different when you identified it, and that's completely fine, because they're not all going to be exactly the same, because there's lots of multiple places where you could identify the value scale, and that's expected to be that's normal. You rarely have an artwork where there is only the value scale that you can identify in one single location. That doesn't make sense. Usually you have light hitting and reflecting. It's going to be on multiple points. Okay, so that's the assignment I had you do. Again, with it, you need to not only identify the different values, but then you were to create the scale and number the scale to match up with the numbers, or if you chose to draw the lines to it, either with the example I gave you, both of those work. But then this idea of getting the sense of it, that it's spiraling down, the reason that we perceive it this way is because of that changing gradient of value scale. If this whole picture was all just one single shade, you would not get the depth of this implied depth of the spiral going down. So again, why this is important, because it shows you, even if you aren't recognizing that you're identifying a value scale, our brain naturally connects to this idea of, oh, we're getting this spiral, and you can see that it's moving downward and it looks like it has depth, because even though it's just a photo, right, that is two-dimensional, we're getting that view of depth because of the value scale, the value, and specifically the value scale as it's transitioning, that is there, which showcases off the light source, which then gives us this perception of three-dimension. Okay. All right, we'll come right to there in just a second. Well, yeah, we'll come back to that in just a minute. All right, we're gonna look at. We're gonna come back to this diagram because I want to just explain it first, and then we'll look at the diagram. So chiaroscuro is what it means directly is Italian for light dark. So light, dark. And it's basically it's a method, or you have the diagram that gives you direction for applying a value to a two-dimensional object. So method, this is a good way to have basically a direction sheet, if you will, on how you can create from a two-dimensional object or artwork, right, to create the illusion of three-dimensional. So if you're not sure, you know, how to go about replicating a light source when you're making a drawing, or identifying that when you're looking at an artwork, this diagram that we're going to go over essentially gives you the tools to say, well, this is the order of how things should be if you want it to look realistic. This was developed during the Renaissance period, as artists were playing around with ways to create a more realistic artwork. And it specifically has 5 areas of light and shadow that you identify. And so this is different than the value scale, because that's just showing all the different values that are in the artwork. This is specifically looking at the different areas that light creates when it's reflected off of an object, which again, the whole point is to recreate how light reflects off of things, because that's how we perceive objects and depth and all that, right? Just think about when you're looking in the dark, your depth perception is bad. You need the light and how it reflects off of everything to get a good sense of depth. But when it's dark and there's not a lot of light reflecting, you get a skewed sense of depth perception. Well, this is exactly the same thing. So what you have first is identifying the light source. That's not one of the 5, but it is helpful. We really need to identify the light source first in the direction it's coming from, because then that's how you'll determine that. One way is to figure out, though, where do you see what appears to be the highlight? and then from there trace back to the direction of the light source. So if you can't automatically tell where the light source is, find the highlight and then work backwards to find the light source. So the highlight, it specifically marks the point where the object is most directly lit. Right, so it's going to be the brightest aspect of the artwork. And this is usually depicted as bright white. So look for the bright white area. You find the bright white spot, then you're going to have the highlight. Then you're going to have the light. And what it is that this is essentially, you go from the highlight and it moves towards the shadow, and it gets progressively less light is cast on the object until you've reached a point where the surface is facing away from that object. So the light is not as bright as the highlight, because you already from the highlight are moving further away from where the light source is directly reflecting off of it. Then you have what's called the core shadow, and the core shadow is when there is a sudden transition to darker values. And that usually happens because of something producing the shadow, right? You have the light. It's not going to be as dark as the cast shadow some of the time, but it will be this you'll have the highlight and light, and then all of a sudden it will go darker. And that's because something in the object itself is creating a shadow. And then you have the reflected light. So this is not very light, as though it's called reflective light. We'll say not very bright or light. It's lighter than the core shadow though, right? So you'll see once you find the core shadow, then what you do to find the reflective light, you look for the next area that is lighter than the core shadow. And this is why it's not as light as the highlighter light, is because this is all light created from reflected light rather than directly from the light source. And then lastly, you have the cast shadow. And this cast shadow is kind of what it says. It's a shadow that's produced by the object or person. Right, so when you have sunlight, it's why, it's our shadow. It's just like a shadow of a person. When you see the shadow of a person, that's their cast shadow. It's the way from the direction of the light source, right? If when we look at the diagram of the sphere, we'll see specifically that it casts a shadow away from the light source. So shadow cast away from light source. All right, so let's look at that. And then we're going to look at the one that I gave you to do, that we were trying to do in the Zoom meeting, but we didn't finish. So you have right here, it tells you that it creates an illusion of solidity and depth by using 5 divine values. That this is that idea of that, right, on paper, this sphere is just a circle. So how am I getting from circle to sphere, right? Well, by using these 5 sources of chiaroscuro to create the illusion that this is three-dimensional. So first, as I mentioned, if you count the light source as one, it's 6. But the light source is really the product that creates all of this. And the 5 listed here are the effects of the light source hitting the object. So see, right here is the highlight. And that is the brightest because the sun or light source is directly shining on that spot on the sphere. And this is going to indicate where your cast shadow is going to be. So we could put that, we'll put that back on there when we're done on the notes. This is important, right? Because if you create a shadow over here, it's going to look off because that's not how shadows react. Just go outside with yourself in the sun and look at different points in time where the light source is hitting you. How does your shadow respond? And that gives you the direction of the cast shadow, right? And so it's moving away from the light source. But you can see here, right, it's still going in the same kind of direction as the light source. Now, depending on where that light source is, right, that's going to end up looking different depending on those circumstances, all right? Then we have light next. And here, as you can see, it's definitely not as bright as the highlighted area. And that's because it's not being directly hit by the light source, but is also a reflection of that initial light source, but is close enough to the light source, to the highlight, that you still have a lighter value, right? So that's key when you're looking at a picture, is once you found the highlight, you know the light is going to be nearby. And that takes up sometimes often a good chunk of space, right? It's not a small area. This is all that light. Then, and actually it really goes down right here. Can you see the line that I'm drawing of where it transitions? If we look at it before, I'll take it off again. Here in the light, you can see a clear change in value. And that is the core shadow. It's much darker and it's a clear-cut like transition. It's not a smooth transition. It goes from that lighter color to a darker color. So it should be obvious, right? It's not like it's just naturally transitioning out. Then you have reflected light where right here, actually it's all of this really, the core shadow, I didn't go quite far enough down. All of this here is slightly lighter. We're separating it here very clearly. Then, right, this is lighter than this. And that's because it's reflected light after the core shadow, where you're getting some of that light being reflected off from the surface that it's on. And then lastly, you have the core shadow, which is the shadow from the sphere or object itself. And just like what I said, a shadow like we create. Okay, so that is Chiaroscuro. This is really helpful. And you do need to know those components, all right? That could be a test question. So being able to identify them and knowing the order that they go in. Let's take a look at this and then one that I gave you. So this one's in your book, right, of being able to take a look at an image and be able to identify the light source, the highlight, light, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. They did this one for you in your book, so I'm not going to mark it up because we can see it here applied. So you have the highlight, which is the brightest point, and you can see it here too. There doesn't have to be, again, on an image, there's not usually just one highlight. You often find them in a couple different places depending on what's going on. But so we can say that the light source is over here. Okay, and then you have the slightly darker but still lighter area. This is hard to see because it's so small. This is the core shadow right underneath the kind of knee, leg, cap kind of area. And then you have the reflected light, and then you have all of this here as the cast shadow, right? This is darker because of her leg. You also have a cast shadow here and there. So again, there's multiple places that this stuff can be identified, but try to think about it in the order. As you can guess, you could start identifying it all over the place, but it's much easier if you try to follow that sequential order of how, like with the sphere diagram, right, of how it goes. is they didn't identify one here and then one here and then one here. They kind of kept it in order because you should see those transitions take place in the art. So here's the one I gave you that I asked you to identify that we were going to do on Zoom, just to get some practice. This is done, it's the character Diogenes, who is Greek and a philosopher. So what we're going to look at is where these different things are. So the first thing would be, right, where are the highlights? So there are some evident ones that should show up kind of obviously, or should be, the highlight's going to be one of the easier things to determine. Well, we can see there's a highlight here. There's also a highlight here. And if you wanted to keep going, you could, here all along this area essentially is highlight. And then you have the hand and areas as highlight as well. This one, well, it's hard to see again, depending on the original color. This is what I could produce on there. If you go to the link, you can see it clearer of the different colors. This distorted it a little bit. So I would refer back to the link I gave you because you're going to get a clearer image of it, which is going to make it easier to identify. So you have the highlight, right? So if we start with this and we say, okay, we're going to look and say this is the highlight that we're going to start with. One, then you can say, well, the light source is kind of coming like this. Okay, and then next is what we're looking for is the light, which is going to be, and they're really close together. So it might be hard to see. Then, can you see that area right here, right? That is the core shadow. Do you see how it transitions? Right, if I remove the drawing for a second. You have the highlight, and I know, like I said, because of trying to get this here, we'll make it, I'll try to make them not quite so close to each other. There's the highlight. There's the light. Here is the core shadow. Oops. I put the wrong arrows there. I redrew the lines wrong. There is the light. There's the highlight. There is the core shadow right there. And it's that quick transition to dark. Now it's hard to see on this one again compared to please go look at the link. But right here is the reflected light. It looks darker on this PowerPoint than in the actual image. And then you have all of this here is the cast shadow. Now you could have done it from this other direction. You could have done it from this direction and looked over there. Right, when I wrote it on the paper, I wrote over to the right because right is going for like this. But I don't have space on this PowerPoint to do it from that direction. So I had to write it over here. But if you didn't do the highlights from his arm, you could have done it from the arm to the leg, and then here would be the core shadow. So the core shadow should be pretty easy to identify too, as well as the cast shadow, right? This is cast shadow here. This is core shadow here. This is highlight here, right? And this is light, and then this is reflected light. So hopefully that helps you get a sense of how to identify it, and it's not in one place. There's multiple areas that you could do it. You could focus on the chicken and look at it from that direction, although it doesn't have as much of a highlight because this person is blocked. He's blocked. Diogenes is blocking it, but it still does have, it's not as obvious, but it still has the different components, and there's its cast shadow. So you could pick a point in this painting to do it and be able to find it. But I gave you 2 examples, or you could try a third on the chicken. So that's the point, right? Is look for the things that are obvious and work your way from that point on to be able to identify it. But again, why being able to identify? Because ultimately, the way that he used these different highlight, light, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow gives us a perspective of a three-dimensional person. Whereas if they didn't properly use these elements, he would not look three-dimensional. Because this is what we would see if we were looking at this person live, if he was alive, and we saw the light source hitting him. These are what we would see even if we aren't consciously identifying them. Okay, so that's why it's so important. So we're going to look at Tenebrism next, which is a type of chiaroscuro. So let me write a few things about that, and then we'll look at these two examples. I believe, let's see. Let's put it as part of that. So we're on D. So this means dark and gloomy. And it is a type of chiaroscuro, but it's more specific and focused on a single light source. So as I mentioned, you might see the light source reflected in the images that we gave as examples in multiple places. But with Tenebrism, it's they use usually a single light source, and what it does is it provides extra emphasis on a single area to draw attention to that subject. It also, as the name suggests, creates a more dramatic and dark feel to the artwork. Because you're playing with essentially this idea of intense contrast of dark and light. And that the artist is intentionally using the dark aspects to point out and draw your attention. It's meant to draw your attention. So you have the single light source here, which is drawing your attention over here. And then you have very dark areas all around. And that's the idea, right? Is that it's surrounded by dark. And that creates this kind of more intense or gloomy or mysterious circumstance. This is the calling of Matthew. Matthew is the tax collector. You can see him here with coins. And then this is supposed to be Jesus calling out Matthew to be an apostle. And then it's the idea of the surprise. Look at him. He's pointing at him going like, him? He's surprised and like pointing to him like, no way, him? But that's the idea, right? It's this kind of this light shining directly onto Matthew, who's being chosen by Jesus. And it's meant to highlight that. Well, you've kind of got this seedy group of people, which that was the impression it was supposed to create, because he's a tax collector who was seen as seedy and corrupt most of the time during the Roman era. And although, like, obviously this is Renaissance style painting with their clothing, even though the time historically of when this would have happened was during the Roman era. So that also shows you Renaissance style of using Renaissance style of dress and showing off religious different icons and scenes, which we'll look at when we talk about the Renaissance and how they play around with that kind of classical style, or even the difference of how they're dressed versus how he's dressed, right? But this is very classical Renaissance style dress, but it's supposed to have taken place historically during the Roman period. But the Romans saw and the Roman Empire saw tax collectors as kind of this, seedy bunch that were dishonest. And so that's also meant to highlight the surprise in his face and the light shining on. And look at him slumped over, hiding himself, kind of seeming unworthy, and then the light shining on him. So it's meant to create, like I said, this dramatic effect. Here's another one, and this was often used during the Renaissance period, where you see a lot of religious artwork during this time. Single light source, baby Jesus, shining out the light onto everyone else. So much so, like he's covering his eyes, and then everywhere else is dark, right? They're only lit by this light source that's coming from the baby Jesus, meant to, your focus goes directly to the baby, and then outward, based on where the light is shining. So it's meant to create kind of this dark and you know, a moody night, where then the light of Jesus as the Son of God is so bright, it's shining on everyone, and to the point that some are covering their faces because it's so bright. So that's the difference between chiaroscuro and what we looked at with it in a more conventional setting of the two, versus tenebrism, where it's definitely dark and moody, and you have a lot more dramatic light. And we go, well, I put that dramatic dark feel to the artwork. That's important. Dramatic and dark feel. And dramatic between the contrast of dark and light. All right, so all of that plays a role. All right, I believe we're on 3 or 4? 3. Okay, so one of the other ways that you can create depth is by hatching and cross hatching. Hatching and cross hatching it's a specific method using lines to create the illusion of depth. Remember I talked about in the first one with lines, how lines are a great source of creating a sense of illusion. Well, this hatching, it does that. It's a series of lines, so series of close lines usually, and then have they're parallel to each other. That's hatching. Cross hatching then is crossing over the hatching lines. Right? It's a variant on hatching. Come on. In which lines overlap. And this suggests value, because we'll look at it in just a second of how you can create it darker. And a greater sense of form and depth. So let's take a look at this. So here's a diagram of cross hatching. You have regular hatching. So see how the lines are parallel here? Now, the other thing that plays a part into it, and I should add that, is how close the lines are. Okay, so it really does make a difference on how close the lines are for how much value. So closer lines are darker value. And then cross-hatching, right, is crossing the lines. And again, more lines crossed equals darker value. So here's an example of, this is by Michelangelo, the head of a satyr. And so you can see areas where there's more intense cross-hatching. You get darker areas, and that creates that sense of depth. And then you have a lighter value with just single hatching that is further apart. So it creates that sense of, right, shadow and light, which you need for that illusion of light. Okay, so that's all it is. It's very basic in terms of what you do with it. So let's just look at an example here of, here would be hatching. And it can be any, you know, size. And then you have, you know, and it can be even closer together. Right? You get it darker. This is going to be lighter value. This is going to be darker value. And then cross hatching. Right, this is cross hatching. And just the idea that you can get more, you can do multiple cross hatchings. So I can go like this, and then I can go like this. Right, so then this is the darker value. Oh, that's what it is. It's lines, and it's just taking parallel lines and then putting them closer or further away. So let's put B here, right? That lines can be far away for lighter value or closer for darker value. The more lines crossed, the darker the value. And that's usually used for depth. And then in general, both are used, both hatching and cross hatching used together for, let's say, displaying light source and shadow. All right, the next method that can be used is space. And within space, this is connected to the idea of size, overlapping, and position. In a work of art, the size of one shape compared to another often suggests that the larger object is closer to us. So size of one shape or object compared to another suggests that the larger object. So this is how you get depth, right? So an example of this would be if you have a really large square and then you had a smaller square, right? This is going to suggest closer and a little bit further away. Now, this shows both size and position. You can also do overlapping, where you have one shape, but then I have a bigger shape that covers the first shape, and this makes it look like closer and in front of shape behind it. Right? So this also, right, all of this gives a sense of depth. Again, closer, further. Okay. Oops. Go to 2. It's another way. So another way to create that illusion of depth is the overlap, right? But position plays a role. So all 3 components, size, overlap, and position, help establish depth. And we'll look at that in an example of art here. This is for space, right? Pastoral or Primavera. So you get an idea of, look right there, her dress is over his shoe, so she's in front, right? And then he's next to her, but clearly just slightly behind her, and also because she's closer and overlapping. Then you have these 2 behind him so that they're further away. And he is in front of the girl. So, and then of course size, right? These 2 are much larger and these ones are smaller. So by simply positioning of further with overlap, with creating larger and smaller sizes, and where on the artwork, right, whether it's in the bottom, the middle, or the back, you place something, it creates a sense of depth. You also can have, I'll write the last 2 and then we'll look at the last 2 examples. So space, we got that one, A, B. We have alternating value and texture. And we have an example of that we'll look at. This is the illusion of depth by, basically in two-dimensional work is often influenced by the arrangement of value and texture, so that you play off of darker and lighter, light to dark, and texture, meaning where you'll have more detail in texture is closer, and blurry or softer texture is further away. Oops, that's not where I wanted to go. Blurry or softer texture, further away. Okay, so we're going to look at an example of that, but I'll just put the last one here, which is brightness and color. With brightness and color, this can also be used to express depth. More intense and bright colors tend to equal closer, whereas the more faded and darker in the sense of not bright colors is further away. So you can play with the coloring of an art to give that sense of depth, right? An example would be a really bright, and this will be in the picture that we see, an intense green, and we'll look at that in the picture, right, is going to, will look closer than a darker green. So you can even play with it with the same color. And here's where value comes into play, and understanding the values of intense or brighter, lighter green versus the darker green. Because, and why this happens is we perceive color that is more intense as being closer because of our eyesight. Essentially, the belief is, right, you can see more color and intensity when something is close. So if you replicate that in the artwork, you get the same illusion. So here's the last ones with this. So here's alternating value and texture. This is in your book too. But so here's texture, right? Look at the trees. And it's not physical texture. It doesn't have to be physical texture, right? But all the trees have this kind of gnarly and twisted, they look thorny, right? They're detailed. These are the trees. Versus here, and even here are trees, right? It's soft and blurry. Okay? The other part is it goes from light, dark, light, dark, light. So you have the alternating light, dark, and then with that combined, the alternating texture that's implied, right? It can be, it doesn't have to be physical texture. You can use physical texture, but then you already have a more of a three-dimensional object as is. It's implied texture. And that creates so that the trees in this part look closer with the lighter part closest, and the mountains look further away, and these trees look further away because they're soft and blurry. And then you only get partial, this will be atmospheric perspective as well when we talk about perspective, where you only see part of the mountain because it's so far away. And then lastly, brightness and color, right? Bright colors appear closer, less intense colors appear further away. Here is that bright green, right? This makes it look close. This also has to do with size and position. So hopefully what you're seeing here is that all of these things play together. It's not usually just one or the other. You use a variety of these fundamentals that you all put together, which ultimately just creates a more realistic perspective. But then we have green over here, right? And that's the darker green, and so it looks further away. But part of the reason is, right, this catches your eye first. Right? This is what your eye is drawn to. And then you have, the use of angles also helps make it look like the train is coming directly at you. It is a darker color, but this is also an intense black. So you have to pay attention to not only dark and light, but intensity. Right? Because intensity is going to have more of that brighter structure. So you can't just call it dark colors, versus light colors. It's this isn't necessarily light, although it has the highlights and stuff in it, but it's more intense. This is black, which you could argue is dark, which would suggest for the way, but it's a very intense color, and then it's aided by the angle that it's drawn in as well. But if you look at all of this stuff back here in the background, it's less intense colors, less intense greens. If you just look at the greens, right? All of the greens, you see and even this one, right? That's closer, but this looks like it's behind that brighter patch here because it's not as bright and intense in its function. Okay, so that's where we're ending today. We are going to look at the last aspect of depth in the next lecture, which is perspective, which you look at atmospheric, isometric, and linear perspective, which plays a huge role in that. And remember, all of these combined together, value, and all these for depth, right, is that you're going to have value, space, and perspective, and you ultimately can utilize all these tools together to create the more realistic aspect of whatever artwork that you're viewing or wanting to create.